Hello, everybody. So, what I would like to talk to everybody about today is a constant that's in our society back, I'm sure, to the beginning of time, is crime and how we punish those who have committed crimes. So, my speech today, I would like to inform the class about capital punishment in the United States, and some of the things we'll talk about is the history of capital punishment, how it came to America, some of the current state of affairs, and how the capital punishment or the death penalty has become what we know of it is today, and then some of the debate over the right or the wrong of capital punishment. So to begin with, we'll start with a little bit of a history. And I took some information off of deathpenaltyinfo.org, and what I found was that the death penalty dates back to the 18th century BC, and we can see it in one of the earliest writings in the Code of Hammurabi. Hammurabi was the king of Babylon at that time, and what he did was write a list of 242 laws that governed that society at that time. Of those laws, it set fines and punishments for crimes as well as other things, and within that, 25 of those crimes were punishable by the death penalty. And interestingly enough, murder in and of itself was not a death penalty crime at that time. So the way that the death penalty came into the Americas, into America itself, was back in the colonial age, when the British came over, and the British having the most influence on the American colonies, and also had a very long history of using the death penalty, and that naturally came over to the colonies when the colonials came over. At that point, the first recorded execution in English American colonies was in 1608 of George Kendall, and he was executed by firing squad, and what he was convicted of was spying for the Spanish. At that time, laws varied greatly from colony to colony, so there wasn't any uniformity as to which laws would have a death penalty, and there was nothing that was the same about any of the colonies. So that led to starting to some of the reform and trying to make some changes so that there was some uniformity. And what we saw was early American reform, and the death penalty came in the late 1700s to the mid 1800s. And what they started doing was starting with degrees of murder and some other crimes, but specifically murder. And the degree would be based on the culpability, the mental state of the person that committed the crime. So in 1794, Pennsylvania, led by Benjamin Franklin, was the first state to abolish the death penalty for all of the crimes other than first-degree murder. So this led the way for many other states to start doing that as well. And then they started reducing the death penalty crimes, and what they did in response to that was start to build penitentiaries to hold convicted people. By the end of the 19th century, several states had abolished the death penalty completely, as did several countries around the world. Into the early 20th century, many American states began to abolish the death penalty completely as well, but by the early 1920s, those states had brought the death penalty back when there was a panic of revolution, and there was strong class conflicts within the country. At that point, more executions occurred in the 1930s than in any other time in American history, and that was the height of the Great Depression. By the 1950s and into the 1960s, public support had begun to wane for the death penalty, and in a Gallup poll from 1966, it showed that public support was down at its lowest at 42%. So that leads up into the 70s and then kind of into the modern area of the death penalty, and that actually begins with the death penalty being suspended, and that happened in the Furman v. Georgia United States Supreme Court decision. And what they decided at that point was that the statute that was written in Georgia violated the Eighth Amendment because they considered it cruel and unusual, because the jury had complete discretion over sentencing, which could lead to arbitrary sentencing of convicted persons. So they found that the death penalty itself was not unconstitutional, but just the statute. So what the state's response to that was to rewrite the statute. It limited the jury discretion, and it set um, regulations for and guidelines for the judge and jury for when they were giving sentences. The death penalty was then reinstated in 1976, again on another U.S. Supreme Court decision, and that was the Gregg decision, which was a combination of 3 cases: Gregg versus Georgia, Jurek versus Texas, and Profit versus Florida. This decision held that the new statutes as they were written was constitutional, and that the death penalty itself was constitutional under the 8th Amendment. So to follow suit, the other states that wished to have the death penalty rewrote their statutes and then reinstated the death penalty. Today in America, currently there are 31 states plus the U.S. government and the federal the military that have the death penalty. But as of today, there are at least 9 states who have a moratorium on the death penalty because there are certain issues that have come up, and there are different ones within each state that they feel that need to be corrected before they can continue on using the death penalty. The main protocol for execution is a 3-drug protocol in which an anesthetic is given, a paralytic, and then potassium chloride, which actually stops the heart. And that's the main method that most states are using. There are some states that still use a 1-drug method, and it's just an overdose of an anesthetic to stop the person's heart. Depending on the state, some states do allow the offender to choose their form of execution, and that would be some of the choice would be a firing squad, gas inhalation, electrocution, or hanging. Attendance at executions, info that I gathered from NPR.org states that the last public execution was in 1936, and that was of a man named Rainey Bethea, and he was convicted of raping and murdering a 70-year-old woman. State laws now have wording that say that executions have to be limited and exclude public view. So there are very limited people that can attend. One of the interesting things that I found was that almost all states allow news reporters, any news reporters to attend, and that's just for the general information of the public. So with that information, we end up coming into the debate, the right and the wrong of capital punishment. And the debate actually goes back, again, to the colonial period. From info that I had gathered from deathpenaltycurriculum.org, there was an essay that was written by an Italian, Cesare Beccaria, in 1764, and it was called On Crime and Punishment. And he condemned torture and the death penalty, saying that it was not necessary, and that fueled the argument at that point. Today, the arguments can pretty much be placed into several different categories. As far as moral arguments for and against, people are believing that a person who has committed murder has forfeited their right to their own life, and that a death penalty is a just retribution for that crime. Others believe that, looking at religious history, that in documents and historically religious hierarchies were in support of the death penalty. Opponents will argue that the death penalty sends a conflicting message to people, which is it's legitimizing the thing that the law is trying to repress, which is actually killing. So it's sending the wrong message to people, and also that today there's no uniformity amongst religious groups as to the morality of the death penalty, and even among Judaism and Catholicism, leaders of those faiths have actually come out and campaigned against the death penalty. There are arguments that say that the death penalty is a deterrent to criminal activity or to criminals who fear long-term imprisonment, while others say that there's research out there that says that's not a deterrent, that there is no more deterrent level from one to the other. And some of the practical arguments are that supporters feel that laws can be made that will only ensure that only the most deserving get the death penalty, while others say that with human error being the way it is, even with the well-run criminal justice system, that there will still be people that will be executed that didn't commit the crime. So based on those arguments, there's one last thing that I would like to leave you with, and that's just that a case that I found, and it was a 1972 case of Kenneth McDuff, when the death penalty was suspended in 1972 from the Furman v. Georgia U.S. Supreme Court decision. Kenneth McDuff was on death row. Well, since the death penalty was suspended at that point, his sentence got commuted to life imprisonment. In 1989, he was still in prison serving his life sentence, but Texas prisons were suffering from overcrowding, so he was released on parole. Within 3 days of being released, he committed another murder, and within the next few years before he was caught, he had committed an extra 5 murders. He was eventually executed, but people point to that as a particular case for the death penalty, and that could have stopped those crimes from happening. So I'll leave that to your opinion. I thank you all for listening. I know it's a topic that's never going to go away, and that will probably be debating this for a very long time to come. So have a good day and be safe.